Hello everyone, Trophy Wine Hunter. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'm really excited to do a tasting of a number of Graham's ports. So I bought this at BC liquor stores. I'll have the price in the comment section. I think it's around $80. But for this you get 5 different ports, and you can try the different Graham's ports and a little bit of each, about 200 mLs of each one, which is plenty for you to taste over a number of times, and so it's a really nice way to kind of get into port. I was fortunate enough to actually visit Graham's Port Lodge in Portugal. I have at the end of this video, and that was a really great experience. Increased my interest in port wines, and so this I think is a really nice way to kind of just try different types of ports. You know, always the biggest ports that get the interest are vintage ports, Quinta, really aged Tawny ports, and those can be quite expensive, but this is very affordable, and that's a good way to kind of get an introduction into port. Let's talk a little bit about Graham's Port House. So it was founded in 1820 by 2 brothers, William and John Graham, and it quickly became a very well-known producer of very high quality ports. And this culminated with the purchase of Graham's Lodge in the Gaia region, or Vila de Nova de Gaia, which is the other side of Porto, where all the port lodges are. And they also acquired their very famous vineyard site, Quinta dos Malvedos, in 1890. In 1892, one of the Symington family, Andrew James Symington, sailed from Scotland to Porto to work for the Graham family, and in 1970 Andrew's grandparents acquired the company from the Graham family, and now the Symington family actually owns quite a few different port houses, Warre, Dow, Symington, and are quite a large producer or quite a large owner of a lot of the port houses in Portugal. I did do an introductory video about port, and that was quite a while ago, but my interest has peaked and I've learned more. So I hope you'll see that video and see how many mistakes I made in that video and how I've grown. So just to go back in terms of summary, port is a fortified wine. So spirits are added to regular wine, and that kind of increases the alcohol content and also increases the sweetness of the spirited, so it's called a fortified wine. Generally, the best type of glass for a port is this type of almost a white wine type glass. It's got enough fill and it's got enough space to aerate. Sometimes you have these small little port glasses. Those are cute, but sometimes they just don't have enough volume to kind of stick your nose in there. So I think this is the preferred way. And the other thing is that how do you serve port? We'll go through each one's. Generally slightly chilled. With vintage ports and maybe with aged Tawny ports, you can have them more at room temperature, but many of the ports that you can have are slightly chilled. The other question that a lot of people have, how long can ports last? In general, the higher the quality of the port, the less time that it can last, just like high quality wines. So it is fortified, it has a little bit more shelf life than wines, but for a vintage port, you're probably looking about a week. And for some of the ports that we have here that are on the more entry level, probably maybe 2 months, but you know, not like a year. It's going to be a little bit of time. It does start to kind of degrade a little bit, but it does have a longer shelf life than wine. So now I'm going to go through each one of these ports as I take them out. And again, it's kind of a mini bottle, but it's quite sufficient. It's about 200 ml. That's plenty for you to have, and you can see how much I have in my glass here, and that's very little of this, so you could probably have like 6 or 8 pours of this. So lots of wine or fortified port for you to be able to taste. So the first one is called a fine white port, and so fine white port is basically a very young, unaged port. And why it's called white port is because it uses grapes that are traditionally used to produce white wines, and these include Codega, Malvasia fina, Rigobato, and Vicino. So you're going to have different flavors of this. It's going to be a little bit lighter and not as heavy and not the plummy type things that are associated with red wine grape varietals. So let's take a smell and a taste. So on the smell, it is lighter than what I expect from traditional ports. It doesn't have that kind of red wine associated plums and things like that. It's much more like citrusy and almost like tangerine, or you almost get a little bit of orange peel on this. So a little bit lighter. And again, it'd be things that you associate with white wine grapes. On the taste, I don't find it as sweet as I do with other ports. It's quite dry in terms of the nuttiness of it. It does have like light fruit. I would say kind of almost like light skinned fruits, almost like pear and apricots and tropical aromas to it. And of course the aftertaste comes with a bit more alcohol and nuttiness to it. But I quite like it. With this, I think it's really important to get this well chilled. So don't have this at room temperature. It's quite light, and I think it'd be really nice as just an aperitif, but you have to chill it quite well. I think if I had to give a rating to this, it's somewhere around 87 points. It's you know, decent product, but quite nice and light, but a little bit, I would use it more as an appetizer, not as a dessert wine. Next, we have their 6 grapes Ruby port. So this would be akin to their entry level, like if you had a champagne house, their non-vintage champagne. This is kind of that for grams. It's their entry level, kind of their staple type of port and ruby style. So just as a reminder, the difference between ruby and tawny ports: ruby ports are not going to be generally aged as long in oak casks. Tawny ports are going to age more in oak casks. In general, tawny ports, once they hit the bottle, then they're not going to improve. Ruby ports, some may, and in particular the high-end vintage ports, they will improve with in age with bottle. So this is going to be, again, a ruby port. It spends very little time in oak. It spends about 1 or 2 years in seasoned wood barrels, but thereafter it doesn't really improve anymore. And that's partially because of the grape selection. It's not going to be the top end grapes that they use. That's going to be saved for the vintage ports. But it is a blend, and it's a blend of kind of local Portuguese grapes. 25% Tinto Barroca, 25% Tinto Roriz, 25% Touriga Franca, and 25% Touriga Nacional. And so it's going to be kind of your classic port. And again, this would be a nice kind of bottle if you just want to try port. It's not that expensive. And this would be a ruby port. So again, ruby ports, because they're not aged in oak, they're not going to be as nutty. They're going to be much more fruity, like the dark fruit flavors. And then with the vintage or the tawny ports, what you're going to find is a little bit more, because they have some oak influence in them, they're going to be much more nuttier, that kind of nut, caramel, oaky type elements to it. On the smell, you can smell the alcohol. So one thing you have to get used to with port, it is around 20%, so you can definitely smell the alcohol, but it smells nice. It does smell very sweet and very thick. Lots of dark plums, kind of black cherries, raisins, that type of flavors. But a little bit of almost slightly kind of dark chocolate in there also, I would smell. But really unctuous and really quite full in terms of the smell. And I was just comparing and contrast this with the Penfolds grandfather rare Tawny, and that one, although it's a port style wine, of course it cannot be called port because it's not from Portugal, and I think it just doesn't have the same kind of depth of flavor that these Portuguese ports have, and partly it's because of the grape varietal that they use. So on the taste, you do get a lot of fruit. Dark cherries, dark plums, and then on the aftertaste you get a little bit more licorice, a little bit of plums, molasses, those type of flavors. Very sweet. The aftertaste isn't exceptionally long. I think that's where, as you get up to some of the more higher end wines or higher end ports, you're going to get a longer aftertaste and a much smoother and much sweeter aftertaste. This one has a little bit of spice at the end of it, and it does kind of drop off a little bit. Very nice product. Again, probably my rating is around 87, 88 points. Very acceptable port. It's not overly heavy, and it's not doesn't last overly long on your palate. So if you're really not into alcohol, this is quite a light style port in my opinion. Next we go to late bottle vintage. So this is late bottle vintage 2017. Again, we're still talking about a ruby port because it's not spending extensive time in wood. And also this is kind of a ruby port where, again, it will not improve anymore with age. So even though it's 2017, it's ready to drink right away. So even if you keep it for another 10 years, it's not going to improve as compared to vintage ports, which actually improve in the bottle. So why it's called late bottle vintage is because it spends extended time in oak, but still that time is actually relatively short compared to a tawny. So for the late bottle vintage, this spends 5 years in oak before in wood before it is bottled, and that's why it's called late bottled. It's later bottled than, let's say, 6 grapes. And it's really interesting to kind of compare and contrast, and that's why I love this type of pack, because we can compare and contrast different styles of port and see which one you really like. And it doesn't really matter in terms of don't worry too much about the expense and what the hype is. Just taste for yourself. And some people like white port. Some people like 6 grapes. They're fine with it. Some people like vintage. And so I don't think you should kind of base it on just points or what's expensive. Just taste and see what you enjoy, because there's a price point for everyone. And I think these packs are so useful because we can go through each one and actually taste side by side and go back and forth and really kind of understand what suits you as a person. The smell, already I'm smelling less fruit. So with the 6 grapes, it was all fruit to me. This one's got a little bit more spice elements and a little bit more interesting characteristics. So I would say it's a little more complex, and the fruit is actually dialed back a little bit compared to the 6 grapes. 6 grapes is all dark fruit, and that's all you taste, and all like sweet fruit. So this one's, I think, is a little more complex. Even on the taste, I think there's 2 things that distinguishes late bottle from the 6 grapes. First is the intensity of flavor. I think it's got better balance. The 6 grapes hits you like a Napa wine, like just fruit forward, bold. The late bottle vintage, I think, is a little bit more complex, more elegant, and it's more subtle. It's a little bit smoother, and the flavors, although intense, don't hit you like over the head. The second thing is that you get a little bit more complexity and delicate things. So again, when we went back to 6 grapes, all I tasted was fruit, like black plums, black cherries. That's all I tasted. This one, I'm getting a little bit of spice elements like cinnamon. I'm getting a little bit more hints of oak, and a little bit of even kind of kirsch flavors. So it is quite a little bit more exotic in terms of the taste profile. The aftertaste is longer. It's smoother. It's got more weight to it, and the taste of it, yeah, on the end is like kirsch, cinnamon. So you can taste a little bit more like maraschino cherries almost, and a little bit of herbs almost, even like baking spice, maybe some honey on elements to this. So a little bit more interesting in my opinion. This is, to me, closer to 90 points. It's close to like 89, 90 points in my books. Now we're going to go to some tawny ports. So again, as a reminder, tawny ports are going to be aged in oak, and they're going to be generally a little bit more nuttier, with more caramel flavors and things like that. In general, again, when you have tawny ports, when you put it in bottle, it's not going to improve anymore. So a 10-year-old tawny port, if you age it for another 10 years, it's not going to get any better. And in general, a 10-year-old vintage port, let's say if it's a 2015 vintage port, is going to be more expensive than tawny. So tawny, to me, is quite a good deal. So for instance, if you have a 50-year-old tawny port, it's expensive, but it's not as expensive as a, let's say, 1975 vintage port. So vintage port is always the most expensive of the ports. So it's a good product. It is aged. And so this one is now aged in 10 years in seasoned oaks, and it's put in oak casks and for 10 years and then bottled, and then after it's bottled, it's not going to improve anymore. So let's try it. So yes, you do get a less fruit flavors on this. You get much more spice. You get more like cardamom, and you also notice the color. On the ruby ports, they'll be much more ruby colored, like purplish, and with tawny ports, they'll look tawny, so they're more brownish in color because they've spent so much time in oak. So yeah, a little bit more oaky, like cardamom, baking spice type aromas to this. On the taste, I actually don't get a lot of nuttiness. I still get a lot of fruit from this. However, the aftertaste is a little bit more nutty, if you could say it, and a lot more caramel, like creme brulee and caramel and toffee. You get more of that with tawny ports, and so that's quite nice. If you asked me to choose between this and the late bottle vintage, I'd probably have this. It's so the late bottle vintage, again, it's got more fruit, it's got more life. This one's a little bit more laid back, relaxing drink that I can see that you have after dinner, and I'd probably rate this around 90 points. Last of the ports we're going to have is the 20-year-old tawny port. Again, it has now been aged 20 years in seasoned oak casks. And again, you're going to hopefully get a little bit more nuttiness. You'll see the color again is going to get as more and more brown. So let's take a smell of this. Of the wines that I've had, this is the least fruity. And all you get here is like almost, you get some pepper, you get some spice, you get some maybe like fruit cake, but a lot of savory components, not a lot of fruit on this. Of the ports I've tasted, this is the most heavy on the palate. It's the most encompassing. And it's probably the least fruity. So this has a great distinction from when we were tasting the ruby ports, the 6 grapes and late bottle vintage. It was much more dark fruits. This is very little fruit. It's almost like candy shop, confectionery, Swedish berries, and then on the aftertaste, a little bit of almost a cinnamon, caramel, toffee, those type of flavors. So it's a completely different product. I would say the 10 is not as obvious, but once you get to 20, it's quite obvious that this is not a fruit forward port, and this is quite obvious that this is tawny and not ruby. So it's a really interesting product. Again, I'm about 90 points on this port. So in summary, of all the ports, again, it's very interesting to go through all of them and figure what you like. I know I don't particularly like the white port. I think that's a great appetizer one, so I wouldn't use that as a dessert. The 6 grapes to me is a decent product, but it's kind of light compared to the other ones. As for the late bottle vintage, the 10-year Tawny and the 20 Tawny, I think it's a toss-up in terms of my favorites between the late bottle vintage 2017 and the 20-year-old Tawny. I think they're very distinct, and I think they've got some intensity. If I'm gonna go to Tawny, I think I'd rather go to the 20 than the 10, because the 10 is not as characteristic of Tawny port. It's still kind of in between. It's kind of young. It doesn't have. It kind of has some fruit and some spice and some oak, and some nuttiness. So it's not as good a representation of Tawny. I think once you get to 20, 30, 40, 50 years, you're really drinking very nice representations of Tawny. So I think this is a much better product. The same thing with late bottle vintage. I think it's a better product from my perspective than Six Grapes. Six Grapes is kind of entry level, and if you don't taste the other ones, you'll be fine. But once you taste, I think you'll comparatively think that the late bottle vintage is better. I don't know the actual pricings of each one. I should put that in the comment section. I'll try to do that. But I don't think the late bottle vintage is that much more than the Six Grapes. And I think for the price, I think I would prefer it. From the 10 to 20, I think there is a price jump. I'm not sure how substantial it is, but I think I prefer that product. So hope this has been interesting and educational. I know it has for me. And I've enjoyed kind of sampling the different wines and the ports and liking the styles. And, it's kind of interesting because I do typically drink vintage port and Quinta port. Those are really my favorite ports. And maybe I'll do another one of that. And tasting these, which would be a little bit more entry level, is also very useful. Like 20-year Tawny port is really good. It's really good. But I'm just so blessed that I've tasted 40 and 50. And I think tasting those and then coming back to these does help me appreciate how good those 40 and 50-year-old ports that I had at Graham's Lodge in Portugal were. And likewise, I had a late bottle vintage that came from Quinta dos Malvedos. That was exceptional. I've had very old vintage ports. Those were exceptional. So it really helps me appreciate the difference, tasting kind of more entry-level wines, how lucky I've been. Hope, again, you enjoyed this. Hope it's been educational. And until next time, happy drinking.